And there it is. September 15th, 11:30 a.m. What were you saying, Jacob?
Hello.
Before hello?
September already.
September, midway through September.
It's
Very
been a very rapid and very intensive year for me. I don't know about you.
no, absolutely. Crazy year for me. The last 12 months were insane. But what makes yours so
Yeah,
intense?
I mean, a 1 year master's program, which was kind of just straight in, straight out. It was over before it started, and then writing the dissertation for that, and a lot of self-development, a lot of a lot of insights about myself, a lot of work in that area, and I'd say it's a time of a lot of different transitions, which is in some way fitting because the world is going through a lot of transitions right now. So
This is a very crazy time, tumultuous time in the world. Probably the most I feel like in our lifetimes, for sure. So,
yeah, yeah, I think a tumultuous personal life concurrent to that really puts you in a state of attunement with global upheaval. So
dude, I bet they're somehow related. I mean, it's pretty nuts. Wait, what did you receive your master's in?
so the master's was terrorism, security, and society.
Really? How was that? How was getting that?
Well, I haven't received my final grades report back yet, but I'm very optimistic. And it was good. It was very quick. For me, I learned a great deal more in my own research than what I actually learned during the course of the program and the 3 modules that I took for it. But it's what I wanted to do. I'm glad that I did it. And it is very specialized, but the people going into that program came from all kinds of areas and were not necessarily themselves in any way specialized in terrorism or radicalization or the study of jihadism.
So that what type of research were you doing? Research on terrorism.
Predominantly on Islamist movements and on jihadism and on the processes of radicalization. Yeah.
Through England or throughout Europe, or were your co-students mostly British, young British people?
Co-students were extensively American, British, and Northern European. Yeah. In regards to the focus, it's a very, very interconnected problem. So, I had an essay on the 7/7 bomber, Sadiq Khan, and that cell. That bombing occurred in 2005 in London, and they struck at the transport networks and the buses and the underground. Um, but if you look at the influences, which were the background to those guys' radicalization, you can very much understand them as global phenomenon. Um, the spread of Salafism was a big influence on those guys, and the spread of
What was
Islamist
that?
Salafism.
What's Salafism?
Salafism is a strain of Islam which has taken on a great deal of importance since the Gulf states were made the richest in all of the Islamic world in the 1970s. So, I mean, effectively all strains of Islam put a huge focus on the early period of the Prophet and that kind of foundational story and myth. Um, but Salafism is the strain which most extensively focuses on on the period of the Prophet, and that informs their understanding of the world today and their approach to political power, their understanding of when it would be correct to use non-violent means of religious propagation, when it would be correct to remain quietist and kind of not be politically active, and when it would be correct to be politically active or militant. So yeah, with the rise of Saudi Arabia and Libya in the 1970s, they had a kind of soft power which spread that influence all over the Islamic world. And so you have communities like the ones that Mohammed Sadiq Khan, sorry, Freudian slip there or something. Those guys grew up in Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities in the UK. But those communities, Islam was influenced heavily in the 1990s by Salafi funding and influence, which ultimately can be tied back to Saudi Arabia, and also by kind of grassroots Islamist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir. And so you had a lot of competing influences for the young generation that was coming of age in the 90s and the 2000s. And they had a big generational fissure with their parents who came from Pakistan or Bangladesh and had a kind of localized, more culturally specific Islam. So kind of clash of identity, and then these new globalized identities, I guess you could consider them, in Salafism and also in Islamism, were mixing together. And that was going on all throughout the 1990s. And then 9/11 happened. 2 years later, the war in Iraq was happening. And basically, the political pressure within mainstream community discourse within Islamic communities in the UK really heated up a lot. And a lot of the predominant mosques, a lot of the student societies were hosting speakers and hosting talks about how can we resist these wars and how can we resist the rolling out of surveillance, and very much interpreted through a lens of Islamophobia and a war on Islam. And I don't know, are you familiar with a guy called Anwar al-Awlaki?
No.
He was kind of the biggest American jihadi preacher, actually based out of San Diego, interestingly enough, for a while. He was in El Cajon, but he was a moderate, so to speak, in the US. You know, did a lot of mainstream media coverage post 9/11, but during that kind of intervening period between 9/11 and Iraq, was immensely popular in the UK and elsewhere. And he would come around and give these lecture tours up and down the country. And the themes of those talks were that there was a war on Islam being waged, and that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan that was being waged was in fact in some ways a pretense for or a prelude to a crackdown on Islam itself. So yeah, what I came to realize focusing on that particular group of guys who blew themselves up on the London Transport Network was that they came from a kind of wider political melting pot. And there was a lot of temperature. And of course, they all had their own personal stories. You know, they broke from family. They formed together in a tightly knit group and kind of adhered to a lot of processes that you might see with someone who joins a cult or anything like that.
Well, yeah. That's a lot of information right there.
Yeah,
Um,
sorry, I just let off.
but no, it's good. So I didn't even realize that this 2005 incident occurred. How many people uh how many people were killed because of that?
It was close to 300 people, I would say.
Are you really
Yeah,
killed?
I think
Casualties?
about
Oh wow, that's a lot.
I think around 270. If my memory serves me correct, it was about a tenth the size of September 11th. But considering the size of the UK, it was relatively significant, um, and it was coordinated. So it really sent shockwaves throughout the whole country, and was the reason that um, all of the counterterrorism and counter radicalization initiatives that we have were created, because suddenly it wasn't just a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was a war at home.
Yeah, that makes it very different. I mean, when you consider I mean, h- how old were you when 9/11 happened? I was 8 years old. Um,
5.
5, yeah. When that happened, I mean, I remember it was a big deal and it was really crazy. And I remember where I was. I remember it didn't even hit me like because I heard something happened. I was 8 years old. I went to my third grade class, and then I heard in the morning that something happened. Something big happened. Went through the whole day, school. No one really, I mean, it didn't hit me. And then I went home and the news, and then just saw that. And that's like kind of the moment where I just remember, like, holy crap, like, this is, everyone remembers where they were. But now looking back on that, you realize the implications. Like, they, that was so destructive and so, I mean, unprecedented. It's just like flying an airplane into a major skyscraper. That is a world icon. It is just thinking about it, it it gets the blood rattling a little bit more so than it did when I was younger because you don't really understand what that means and what that is. So, um,
It
I mean,
was immensely creative in some ways on the part of the Al Qaeda plot developers. A real like spectacle, and has become kind of like the case study of terrorist bombings. But it certainly is an isolated event, even though it was very innovative. It did come within a broader string of jihadist terrorist bombings, which had been going on since the 80s. And there was an attempt to blow up the World Trade Center, which occurred in the late 90s using a car bomb, I believe. But that was intercepted by the FBI.
uh, do you know who funded those efforts? Which branch of Islam? Which or any?
Uh, I believe the initial attempt was organized by a guy called Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was famously the blind sheikh. Um, but he was those attempts, I believe, were linked to Al Qaeda as well. Um, the kind of drive to create an international campaign of terror attacks against U.S. assets was one that was started in the 90s by Al Qaeda. Um, the USS Cole bombings. Um,
What are those? What are the cold bombings?
the USS Cole was a U.S. warship which was bombed by Al Qaeda militants during the 90s. I'm a little loose on the exact details, but during that time they also struck embassies uh, in 2 countries in Central Africa. And yeah, I mean, it's very the origin point of suicide bombing as an effective tactic. You do see it with Tamil Tigers a little bit, which is a non-Islamic terrorist organization, but
Where are they
it was
based out of?
really, it was they were based in Sri Lanka. That was kind of a tactic used in the ongoing Sri Lankan civil war by the Tamil Tigers. Uh,
Wow. I find that surprising that a terrorist group can survive on a island. But continue.
yeah, so it was actually Shia militants in Hezbollah in Lebanon who blew up a U.S. embassy, a U.S. Army barracks in Lebanon, and a French Army barracks in 1983 and killed, I think, thousands of US troops. And the effect of that was to cause Ronald Reagan to pull out US presence in Lebanon. And so it was enormously effective. And then that tactic kind of functioned like a meme and it jumped across when those Shia jihadists were working together and collaborating and sharing information with Palestinian militants. And there was also some exchanges which occurred with Al Qaeda. And so it kind of cross pollinates. And you see with terrorism this tendency for tactics to be innovated and then to kind of jump across to different movements and mutate. And it's got a kind of genetic or memetic kind of quality to it, which I've written about.
In your dissertation, you wrote about it.
Uh,
What do
that
you
was
mean
more
by
in my
what do you
that
mean
was
by
more of my early research essays. Yeah, focusing more on the terrorism side.
what do you mean by memetic?
So most people are familiar with meme, as in the term created by Richard Dawkins back in the 70s in his book The Selfish Gene. And when he created that word, what he was doing was creating a unit of cultural transmission, which would kind of be the cultural layer on top of the genetic layer. So you have a gene and it's transmitted through reproduction, and those genes can be advantageous or disadvantageous. Um, for example, there might be a gene which selects for let's say greater muscle strength or something, and that's advantageous and causes that person to reproduce more, and thereby propagates in the wider gene pool. A meme is not occurring at the genetic level, it's occurring at the cultural layer. So it can be in language or imagery or basically something which can be communicated in the cultural substrate and move around and be replicated and spread and mutate. And so, obviously, for most of us growing up in the 2000s, memes was like pictures of kittens, basically, humorous kinds of memes. But in the academic field, you can use meme more broadly. You can talk about terrorism as having a kind of memetic quality because that image of the towers burning and collapsing was so highly memetic, and it was so fit for the media um, networks at the time, which was all television, cable television, etc. So this was the medium through which everybody got their news, and it spread very effectively all over the world. Um, and so there's this relationship between memes and the platforms on which they spread. Now that we have the internet, it's faster, and there's less centralized control and many other different characteristics which we could go into for hours. But that definitely affects the kinds of memes which are selected for something which is likely an event, a terrorist event, or some other kind of event, which can spread virally through networks like Twitter, through Facebook, is something which has memetic qualities. And they're not necessarily, there's no moral component to memetics. You know, it could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. The real question is, does it spread? Does it have that quality which allows it to replicate and spread throughout the network? Can it mutate
There,
into forms?
there, yeah, good. What would be considered good or bad actions that are very mimetic. If you do hard work, I feel like that's mimetic. One terrible thing in American culture, and absolutely Islamic terrorism is mimetic. I mean, if you think about it, 9/11 definitely fueled some fire in some people who, if they weren't in the happiest state, probably did that. And then, I mean, it's continued on. The Paris attacks were just how many years ago? 3, 4 years ago. So, and that devastated, I think 100 people plus were killed.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, Charlie Hebdo was 2015, and then the Bataclan was, I think, 2016.
Charlie who?
Charlie Hebdo was
Is
the French satirical magazine. The cartoonists
what did
who are killed in their offices for producing this satirical magazine, kind of a left-leaning, um, anti-authoritarian kind of magazine with very crude cartoons, which they produced of the Prophet Muhammad. And so they were all killed in that office, and that kind of sparked a huge debate in the Western world, which was centered around this hashtag Je suis Charlie. Um, and many people were calling out in solidarity of these cartoonists who'd been killed by jihadists in that office with Kalashnikovs. And there were also a lot of people who were saying, not necessarily that they had it coming, but writing op-eds in the Guardian and other places saying actually they were racist, they were Islamophobic, they were punching down. Um, and so that's a kind of debate which goes all the way back to Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses and the whole uproar which occurred around that in the
who's
late
that?
80s. He's a British Indian author. I think he's won a great deal of literary prizes, but most well known because in 1989 he had this book published, The Satanic Verses, which is a kind of fantasy fictional book which loosely plays around with the foundational stories of Islam. And Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa calling for the death of this author. And it went all over the world and caused a great deal of backlash. And you had kind of various Muslim activist groups in the UK organizing book burnings of this guy's book. And then you had governments giving response. At the time, most governments and most of the Western institutions were pretty strongly on the side of Rushdie, but it was kind of the starting point of these controversies around blasphemy against Islam. And ultimately, he went into hiding for years and years and years and years and had to have high security because there was this constant threat of death, and he had translators in other countries, I believe in Japan and might have been Italy, who were murdered or stabbed. One was murdered. One or two others were also.
In Japan?
Yeah, one was in Japan, two
Wow.
others in Europe, but global it was a global extension of the boundaries of Islamic blasphemy in a way which had never occurred in history, really, because Sharia had always been for Dar al-Islam, and like
What's
within
Sharia?
I mean within the actual terminology, it kind of refers to the way or the path, but for conversational purposes, it's law and the broader corpus of law, from personal to public to the regulation of war and so forth. But that had been confined to Islamic territories, and after the Rushdie affair, it suddenly became the case that um, what what was deemed blasphemous in Islam became a concern for everybody, and has not been that conflict has not been resolved to this day, and continues to flare up systematically.
How do you feel it is in 2019 compared to say 2015 or 20 earlier, like 2011 to like that?
Yeah, I actually wrote my undergraduate dissertation exploring this topic, so it's a good question for you to ask me. But I kind of tracked from the Rushdie affair to the Danish cartoons crisis, which occurred around 2006, 2007, which was a similar incident, but in many ways an escalation, and then Charlie Hebdo in 2015. Um, my sense is that there is a shift away from siding with the Ayatollahs and siding with the enforcers of blasphemy. During the Danish cartoons crisis, you had a whole host of Islamic countries in the OIC kind of coming together and trying to diplomatically isolate Denmark and force them to prosecute these cartoonists who had, like Charlie Hebdo, published cartoons of the Prophet. And there were riots and protests all across the Islamic world. Hundreds of people died. Much of the flames were actually fanned by clerics within the Islamic world who sought to use this issue to shore up their own power in their own countries and with their own people. Um, and the thing about the Danish cartoons crisis, which was so unnerving, was that a very large number of the Western um, leaders and institutions effectively issued apologies on the behalf of Denmark. And a significant reason for that was that it was dead in the middle of the war in Iraq, and so there was this strategic component to it, which I don't know that there necessarily is now. And now, the jihadist insurgency in Europe and the West has intensified so much since 2009 and 2010 that there is a growing awareness of the nature of the problem. And I don't think that kind of simplistic argument that used to be made of, well, Islamic communities in the West are a minority, and therefore criticism of Islam is punching down and oppression of a minority by a majority. I don't think that holds as much anymore. But it's still
Aren't
on the edge. There's a lot of people who would not stand up tomorrow if a cartoonist was murdered, and would actually, write op-eds and send out tweets passive aggressively attacking the whoever was unfortunate enough to be killed for doing a cartoon.
Yeah, it makes no sense. I mean, that's where I mean lines have to be drawn when you're literally killing in the name of God. It's not, yes, he might have disrespected the religion, but the issue is the repercussions of them doing that seem way too intense. Um, there's little forgiveness there. It wasn't that big of a deal. They drew some cartoons and published it. It wasn't the most respectful, but you just have to look at the judgment to action, and at times it just seems like there's just such a lack of forgiveness within Islamic judgment that how can one progress forward? How do we as a human species progress forward with this? I mean, for one thing, as something that, maybe you take some things and leave some things behind, but the culture of Islam seems to have a problem of leaving some of its literature behind. Um, and due to immigration within Europe, it's affected, home base for Europeans drastically and altered the country in the last 15 years, because I have some family that live in a town outside of London. So even I've noticed the changes in the city as a tourist over the years. But that globalization of idealism doesn't just stay in um, isn't just reaching, North America and Western Europe. It's also bleaching into South America. Do you know about that?
Please elaborate.
I actually don't know. I was just told by someone that there are pockets of Islam communities within South America, and just now that airplanes, air travel's cheaper than ever, there are more planes out there than ever, maybe less after the Boeing incident, but um,
I
still,
don't know about South America, but I did read a paper called Jihadis of the Caribbean, which was kind of a play on Pirates of the Caribbean, and it was all about um, these Islamic communities in, I believe it was Barbados or Trinidad and Tobago. Yeah, Trinidad and Tobago. And they had a very significant Islamist militant tendency. And during the period of the rise of ISIS, you had a very substantial number of jihadist fighters going from Trinidad and Tobago to Iraq and Syria. And it was, I think, relatively similar to the number that came from Belgium relative to population size. So it was very significant. Um, but as you were talking about this violence and why it's so extreme, there's two things which were coming up for me. This unforgiving characteristic, I think, is ultimately a lot of these things at the kind of conceptual level are rooted in the emotional culture which surrounds those belief systems, and so it's kind of rooted in how the individual adherents of that faith emotionally relate to the texts, how they relate to the stories, how they relate to any challenge to the authority of those stories. And you could even hypothesize that that kind of understanding of authority in relationship to criticism, which you see around blasphemy and around the Quran particularly, and around depiction of the Prophet, that's probably replicated in the openness to criticism of, say, um, paternal figures at the family level, um, to criticism of community leaders and to the actual culture at the community level. These things don't tend to arise out of a vacuum. And the other thing which was coming up, kind of threading that back in with what we were talking about in regards to memes, I listened to this really interesting talk by Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's kind of one of the intellectual deep web figures based out of the US. And he's talking about memetic complexes and the idea of a religion as a memetic complex, or an ideological structure as a memetic complex. And so it's a collection of memes, and you have kind of memes which are designed to promote strong in-group cohesion, memes which are designed to create hostility to the out-group, memes which are very motivational, memes which are very fear-inducing. For example, the belief in a punishment by hellfire is immensely memetic, especially for illiterate desert-dwelling peoples. But really, for most of human history, that's going to be an idea which is so powerful that it's going to be selected for.
Say the
And
idea one more time.
the fear of eternal punishment in hellfire is
Okay.
an example of a memetic component of memetic complex of a religion. And so when you're talking about this sharp, violent response to criticism of Islam, I see that as almost a kind of biological, memetic thing, that it's kind of a reinforcement of violence against any criticism from outside, which creates that internal coherency, in the same way that, you know, creating a kind of distrust or separation to non-believers would be very essential to keeping that community together. So
Yeah.
an intolerance of blasphemy is actually probably an essential meme for the survival of the Islamic memetic complex as a whole. Because if you were to not have that meme selected for, if you were to allow for a rich diversity of criticism and dialogue around all topics, then the whole structure would be compromised.
That's exactly. That's completely the case. And then, I mean, isn't that even more so in Shia Islam than Sunni? Just
Um,
based, didn't you write an essay on that? Or either way, we'll get back to that. But the one thing I
yeah.
did want to say is, you know, about memetic effects. Um, Someone who had an incredibly positive memetic effect, I would say, is like Steve Jobs. Steve
Mm,
Jobs, he, you know, just had this sense of ability, this sense of ownership, this sense of I can do this, and you know that's these memetic effects. They're very powerful, and you know that's an example of where an individual made incredible leaps forward through, you know, just his sheer belief system, and able to translate that to other people through something like a memetic effect. So
mm.
this that ideal of, you know, having, you know, memetic effect within you is very powerful. And I mean, it's the same way. If you think everyone's doing blasphemy against you, then that's how everyone around you might feel too. I mean, that's an effect as well. But yeah, it's it is powerful and more translatable than ever because we're more interconnected. More people know English the most universal language now than ever. So, and everyone gets their news. Not everyone. I don't know about everyone, but we in the West get our news like that from multiple different sources. So, yeah,
Yeah, what you just said really touched on something that I've been thinking about a lot, which is kind of individuals as being nodes in networks and not just having the potential to be like a node who like receives memes and like sends them out and like, is kind of just reflecting and replicating. But when you get an individual who is so authentically and uniquely actualized in whatever way that shows up, um, they are a producer of memes. So I don't know, someone like Nelson Mandela, I guess, or Steve Jobs is a good example too. Um, Someone who's able to articulate a vision so fully in themselves and in their actions, um, that their words themselves become memetic and spread outwards. And in a way, you know, this is where the memetic understanding of the world as it exists today kind of has a spiritual or ethical layer to it. Because if we understand ourselves as these nodes and in relationship to all of these other people and all of these micro interactions, um, then the quality of the interactions that we have and the nature of the speech which we put forward, the things that we write, the ways in which we contribute to the information ecology on social media, um, every single one is kind of shooting out there and making ripples and reinforcing those tendencies within the wider environment. So it's an immensely empowering thing, but it also puts a great deal of responsibility on you as an individual to realize what you say and what you do and all of your actions, down to the level of smiling at the guy who's taking out the garbage cans, all the way up to, what you write and what you publish in your books and whatever it is. All of those things are having an effect on reality, which is affecting other people's experience and affecting what collective reality we experience.
it is a great deal of responsibility we all hold towards not only ourselves but our community, our family, everyone, and the actions we go about doing have repercussions past what we see and what will be there in the present moment. There's going to be repercussions for our actions now in the future. Those repercussions can be solid, like really good. You worked out today and ate a salad. That's those repercussions of that will be good. And then there are other memetic effects. This is going to be, I talked about Steve Jobs earlier, but one that's deeply affecting and I think hits a lot closer to home with Americans today, definitely, would be something like the Columbine shooters, um, who, I
Mm.
mean, those guys, what they did, and that idea, it's now 15 years later, and that idea is just kind of devastating communities around the nation. I'm sure if I was a young kid going into middle school or high school right now, I would be scared for my life. And that is nothing close to how I felt when I was going to school. So for a young kid to feel like that, it's something that, you know, I don't,
Mm.
there's no real
Yeah.
answer. I don't have the answers, but it's something that we as older people who aren't in school need to be aware of, that our kids are probably a little pretty scared right now, pretty scared to go to school, and one other thing is like Also, I think we as a nation have gotten a lot better at this. I've noticed the media has gotten a lot better at this. Um, we all know the Columbine shooters, but the more recent ones, I don't feel like are are staged. Aren't we look at we're starting to look at the victims more so than the perpetrators, and I think we as a nation and the media has gotten a lot better at that through the as this epidemic has gone about. But still, I mean, memetic effects, they're huge,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
we
It's
we
very comparable to terrorism in that respect. It's kind of a meme of nihilistic destruction, really, and you just see ways in which these individuals tend to inspire other individuals with that nihilistic, destructive tendency. And you wonder whether you describe this fear, this underlying fear, which children and students in the US are subject to. Um, it's really immeasurable what the effect of that is because it's such a low-lying, it's a very kind of low-lying fear which is going on within the culture, but it's hard to assess, how is that manifesting in the psyche? How is that affecting behavior? How is that affecting even possibly development?
it definitely, I think, affects development somewhat. So just something that we all need to be aware of as Americans, particularly. Uh, and luckily, we don't have kids. Hopefully, by the time we have kids, this is all some resolution has come about, and this is a little bit, the situation is a lot less tense than it currently is.
Mm. I mean, I would say I certainly, not growing up in the US, growing up in the UK, but we are very much a kind of satellite of the US media. And there's a large extent to which the people in the UK really look into the US media in a way which the US people do not look into the UK media. Um, but suffice to say, when I spend time in the US, when I'm in San Diego, um, I'll be in a shopping mall, a crowded cinema auditorium, and this thought will crop up into the back of my mind. And I'll think, there's just like this sudden realization like, oh, I'm currently at risk of someone showing up and shooting everybody. And there's no way to assuage that fear in the same way that um, in the wake of a terrorist attack, people go into public transport and they see someone who looks shifty and leaves a bag there a little too long, and the fear response is triggered.
Definitely, and I mean, it is a threat everywhere. You know, if you see someone carrying a weapon, it's definitely unnerving. Um, for some reason, I'm a little less unnerved if they're in a uniform. Usually, if you comply with officers, especially in America, I just feel like they're pretty they're pretty gracious and understanding as long as you're not endangering other people and complying with what they say and making sure that everyone's not being a question mark of is this guy going to am I safe around this guy. um, but other than that, if you see someone without uniform with a weapon, it's very, very, very dis- it makes you a little distraught. So, but the thing is that even though it's happening in schools, like that's the craziest thing, and maybe not completely. I mean, there was obviously the Orlando shooting and the Las Vegas shooting, um, and even yeah. So it isn't just happening in schools, but it's it's a and it's actually not just happening. I mean, different ages of perpetrators are doing it. You know, the most recent ones in Texas have been a little bit older, but then the Orlando shooting guy was like mid-age. I believe the Vegas shooting guy was older, and then the Dayton guy was. I mean,
Mm,
it's terrible that I actually do know all about these people, and they're all fucking terrible people who did a horrible thing. Um, so
yeah, yeah, and
I
that
don't know.
the particularly I mean, they're all horrifying in their own way, but the scale and the nature of that Las Vegas shooting, especially because
Oh,
I've stayed in that hotel before and I've been to events around there, and just the feeling of vulnerability to that, which has been created, you can't. Yeah, I mean, there's really no words for that. One thing
dude,
which I have
go.
heard come up in the wake of a lot of attacks is this idea that, I mean, it's not even an idea, it's a reality that most of America has become conditioned, desensitized, emotionally desensitized to this violence to the extent where it becomes increasingly difficult to sustain normal amounts of empathy for most people.
Dude,
Um,
I don't know. I kind of speaking to some coworkers about this, it seems like after it just I think Americans right now are having a real we're questioning, you know, this aspect of our country because it's not just it's gotten too crazy. And just talking to some coworkers about it, I mean, I think we're all a little bit distraught. If I was a parent, like, oh my god. And at the end of the day, I think the only thing that will happen that could really happen is I don't think people will have their guns taken away. I think people with war military grade weaponry are just going to have to voluntarily give up their guns and say, I don't need this one. Or I think that's going to have to, it's just going to have to be gun voters who are going to have to say what they want, because I don't think we as a country are going to take them away from them. Maybe we could stop selling military grade weapons, but as
no,
far,
yeah, that's I mean that's really the path which has been taken in Australia previously when they had their mass shooting. They did a voluntary, I don't know if it was voluntary, but they did a buyback of some kind where the state bought out people's weapons. I don't think they outlawed weapons completely, but there was a big cutback. The UK had a shooting in the 90s, extensively tightened up the laws and did a kind of buyback amnesty type thing. Um, but I wonder whether, or there's two things. One, which I wanted to bring up before, was this question of the images of the effects of this violence. Many people have raised the question of whether, in fact, in spite of the rights, the legitimate grief of the families, images of the effects of this weaponry and this violence should be publicly broadcast.
yeah,
Whether that is going to be the thing which shocks the nation's conscience after so many preschools and high school students and just you read the stories and you read the descriptions and you see the interviews of the crying students outside of the high schools, but
if the Sandy Hook massacre photos came out and were leached into CNN or Fox News, I think guns, oh my God.
I think it
Every,
would have an enormous effect.
it
Yeah.
would be, oh my God. If you just saw that, what that night, oh my God, it would just drive people.
Yeah.
Oof. I mean, we don't. I don't think we can comprehend it. I really don't think it's when you actually realize, something that was really crazy. I don't know if you know about Ray Rice. He was an NFL running back who was good to go. He was just going to get suspended for 2 games for punching his girlfriend. And then that was good. No one cared, blah, blah, blah. And then the video came out of it. And he
Mm,
was cut from the NFL. He didn't get to play. It was literally everybody knew he did this. It was on the news. Articles were written about it. People wrote about it. He admitted to it. Yada yada yada.
yeah.
And then the NFL agreed to a 2 game suspend. I think it was 2 game suspension. And then the video came out, and it
Oh,
was just freaking. So I agree with what you just said. I mean, if we, saw, I mean, that's the reason Vietnam,
yeah.
was protested against so heavily, and
Especially
that's
the My Lai massacre is a great example of this.
yeah. Was the My Lai massacre were there pictures of that out? I didn't.
I don't know. I don't know when they were released. I've certainly seen pictures from that massacre. I want to say that investigative journalists outed those images, but
Yeah, holding a gun is a. I mean, you talk about memetic effects. If you want to have a lot of responsibility, which I don't, I prefer less. Oh, buy a gun. I mean, like I read an article recently about it. It's like, do you really want the responsibility of owning a gun? I was like thinking about it. No. No, I don't, because it's just too instant, and I don't know.
yeah,
But yeah.
yeah, it's as we're talking about it, I'm starting to get a sense that there's like a real separation that the media apparatus has created between the events and how they are received. And the event of the violence and then the kind of transmission of that into cable news and into these breaking news images and these images of people running and screaming and interviews and crying bereaved families as a kind of detachment which is occurring there, which is difficult to put your finger on, but you have to wonder whether a change in the media landscape is also going to be a part of how this evolves.
It will probably be a slow evolution with minor changes throughout that will, culminate into something completely different within 10 years or 15 years. Um, I mean, the internet has changed news. I mean, maybe not for older generations, but we as young generations don't just turn on CNN and sit down. We go to, CNN.com, FoxNews.com, MSNBC, Reddit,
Yeah,
Facebook News,
it's not
Google
even
News.
direct. It's
Yeah,
Facebook. It's a combined feed.
yeah, exactly. So it will, I'm sure it will evolutionize past this as well into something unrecognizable.
Is I actually discussed this exact topic on the men's retreat that I was on last weekend with a
Oh, how
couple of
was that?
guys. Very good.
What was good about it?
Surpassed all of my expectations. My experience of male groups, etc., had been being in a social fraternity um, in the U.S., and so that had introduced me to certain truths and values which I had previously not understood. I'd kind of come to realize, okay, if you get a large group of men together and kind of band them around certain shared experiences or ideals, you can create an enormous amount of group integrity and trust within that grouping. But the fraternity environment was really concerned. Um, a lot more with socializing, and it was ultimately kind of college men organizing other college men. The retreat that I just went on was a kind of men of all different ages. I was the youngest guy there. I was guys in their 20s, 30s, 40s. One guy in his late 60s. It was much more focused on like um, deep personal work, effectively. Yeah, and it used a lot of techniques from men's work, which consisted of things like circling, where it's kind of similar. A good reference point would be like an AA meeting, but kind of guys sitting in a circle and each person speaks and other people listen, um, and a whole host of different like trust building and different exercises to get men into their emotions and into their bodies. And it was a transformative weekend for me. But
What was
in regard,
transformative about it?
I was able to experience a level of um, trust and vulnerability in a large group of men that I've never seen or experienced in my life.
Much
Uh,
more so than the fraternity.
yeah, with the fraternity, you have this sense of like, okay, we're bonded together. There's trust. You're kind of in my group. I'm gonna be friends with you. I'm not gonna talk shit about you behind your back, etc. Um, but
You would hope.
it wasn't like okay, we're all gonna talk about the ways in which we're not showing up in our personal lives. Um, we're not going to talk about our relationships to our women. We're not going to talk about our relationships to our fathers. We're not going to be using um, meditation and um, physical exercise and breath work. There was a lot of interesting breath work used at this retreat, and so um, it's an altogether different experience. And one of the things it really did for me, there was a lot of things that happened and transpired, but it really showed me a way of communicating which I had not been trained in, which is really just speaking like from feeling and not kind of speaking from up here, not kind of premeditating what you're going to say. And so these exercises where you're in a circle and you go around and maybe it's 2 minutes speaking or 45 seconds or like 6 minutes or whatever it is, and whatever the topic is, you're really encouraged to not premeditate what you're going to say, but to
Y-
make sense aloud within this trust. And you're kind of making sense aloud and you're speaking from feeling. Um, and that's an issue, that's something a lot of men really grapple with and don't know how to do. And if they were able to do it, um, would find that they could figure out a lot more things about themselves and about their relationships. And I've certainly found that it's been very helpful in my own relationships. So
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. I think one of the reasons in that at the retreat I was at, they called it a sangha when you sit in a circle and then everyone says something about a topic. But during the time when you're supposed to be listening, you know, like that's why I really love it. Is because when
mm,
I go there, I am expecting people to listen to me. Well, maybe not expecting, but that's the hope. Like,
yeah.
you
And
know,
you're not
like
thinking about what you're going to say whilst they're speaking. You may be because you're kind of slipping and you're nervous, but if you're doing it correctly, you're fully putting your attention and also your empathy onto what these guys are saying. And you can't really do this exercise without tapping into empathy. So it's really just a foundational things about being human that we do not know how to do, and especially in the context of all male groups, there's a tendency to keep it at the level of banter and to not delve into the
Emotions.
darkness within one another's souls and so forth. Um, but it's in that opening up and sharing the difficult things that we come a lot closer together. And that's certainly what I found in the course of the weekend, because I went from a group of, I don't know, 40 or 50 strangers, maybe less, to, by the Sunday evening, there was just like immense like love and integrity and trust between every single man in the retreat. And it was just an astounding thing to see happen in the course of only 3 days. But it's that
Yeah.
sharing experience and sharing vulnerability and really getting to know each other, not in terms of, oh, like, which company do you work at and which sports team do you like, but like, what is the thing that you are most concerned that you need to work on, or what's the thing that's causing you anxiety? And then also, having men, there was also elements of it which were not just self-critical, but kind of appraisal. But appraisal coming from a deep and felt place. So when you would go around, particularly towards the end, and you would talk to the men in your circle about what you had seen in them over the weekend and what they had like, the potential that they had shown, there was this kind of affirmation that people were able to give to one another, which came from a very deep place. And it's really, to have people around you who can tell you what they really feel about where you're not showing up and where you have immense potential, um, and kind of verbally affirm and speak into being that potential is enormously powerful thing.
Some people resist it very strongly, some people embrace it, but I think at the end of the day we all can appreciate it, and even if we at the in the moment of receiving that, what we see as just unnecessary criticism, I think when you look back on that and you take their word, even if they didn't deliver, that judgment so smoothly, so kindly, you should still, consider what they said, see if you believe that it's affecting you. And if it really is something that is probably true, then I think you can appreciate, a little bit of honest sincerity versus, not saying anything and just letting it slide. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean that. Um, I think for a lot of men, obviously, a big theme of it was really just detachment from feelings as a whole, and that was certainly one of the focuses for me. But there's a big difference between elements about yourself which maybe your friends will joke about, and there's a way in which we bring these things to light through joking, and that's necessary, and we can't really grow close to one another without making light of those things. There's a big difference between joking about it and really looking into dude's eyes from an established place of trust and empathy, and just telling him like, yo, I really feel like you're um, not showing up in this way that you could be, or whatever it is. And yeah, you
yeah,
can really take that on, and you can take it to heart often, especially if the other people who are present have a great deal of discernment. Um,
exactly. You have to know who your audience is, who you're listening to. There's a lot of crap being spewed out there, so we definitely have to take everything with a grain of salt, even if it's from the most esteemed person, educator in his field of expertise.
hmm. Well, maybe as we're drawing to a close, I'll pick up that last thread about the discussion I had at the retreat, because we were talking about the mass shootings and how it's often get stuck on this kind of antagonistic binary discussion about more gun control or mental health or um, whatever it is. And what I was asking to that group and what we were kind of talking about was whether this issue is actually should be a cause for a very, very deep kind of introspection and upheaval at the level of like American spirit almost. Sort of in the way that Jordan Peterson has discussed the phenomenon of mass shootings. He kind of talks about it in biblical terminology as like Cain and Abel, and it's like the spiteful nihilism and just hatred of man and hatred of everything and hatred of God, which shows up in that story. And I found that to be a very compelling analysis, but I do wonder whether this should be, obviously it needs to be addressed in terms of media and in terms of gun control, but whether it should actually be the pivot point or the thing which is the catalyst for a whole deep discussion around community, how many people know who their neighbors are, etc. Decline of Christianity, which was the substrate of much of the American culture and the machinery through which community existed. Whether there is a kind of corrosion or rot at the heart of some of that modern American capitalist ethos, and whether there's some relationship there that needs to be deeply considered.
Yes, I mean,
That's how I'm viewing it increasingly, is that you can't have the discussion about gun violence without having the meta discussion of all of the things that are going on structurally and spiritually and socially and culturally.
no. If you want to talk about implementation of, serious laws that affect the Second Amendment of this country, I mean, I know it's the Second Amendment of this country, and it's just like it obviously was a big deal. It's still a big deal. I really don't think like there's a little bit of it. It definitely doesn't have the same implications it did in 1776. I mean, in 1776, if you wanted to and had a gun in America, you could just be a free wild man, and that was the idea of it. But I mean, it's not necessarily the case anymore. So, um, I, there are a lot of questions. The death of religion in the West, Christianity, um, community is something that, yeah, I think we all really, really desire it. It's difficult to make it a strong part of your life when we work a lot and we're really tired, and you get home and you don't want to do anything. You don't want to go out and see people, or you don't want to go out to the local activity, or even on the weekend. So yeah, it's something we definitely have to come to appreciate and put into our lives. And I think it will make us a lot happier if it will make our community safer, one, and it will make us as people a lot happier.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole host of things which are affected by it. The epidemic of loneliness, which is occurring right now. There's a whole discussion around kind of pre-agrarian tribal communities and the family structures there, and how there may have been certain things which are advantageous to growing up in the context of a larger community. If your parents are maladaptive, you have these other paternal figures within your community structure, and you have this wider safety net. And you can still see, many of those things playing out in smaller religious and ethnic communities in the U.S. Communities from the Middle East and elsewhere who really prize family, and work together that way.
Extended family.
Yeah.
Is there, so Jacob, it's about that time. Is there anything you want to say before we end?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say there's a lot of work to do, and all of us need to take on the maximum possible ability to become those memetic agents that we have been envisioning.
And with that, my guest today is Jacob Kishere. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.